All right, everyone. Welcome to episode 4 of the Paragon A podcast. My name is Robert Yo, and as usual, I'm joined by my fellow co-hosts, Robin, Richard, and Simon. This episode is the second in a two-parter on electric vehicles, or EVs. In the prior episode on this topic, we delved into the growth of EVs on our roads today, the types of people buying an EV today versus an ICE car, current reasons not to buy an EV, the state of the UK's charging network, and actually how does Tesla cars and Tesla's charging network compare to everyone else's? And really, where is the pollution emitted from a car journey actually coming from? Is it the exhaust or is it the tyres? Now we're going to double click into the environmental impact of manufacturing the millions of electric vehicles and batteries needed to meet the net zero commitments in the second part of our story. Because remember that the UK, along with other countries, has drawn an ambitious line in the sand by saying that internal combustion engines will no longer be allowed to be sold as new cars in 2030 or 2035. So over to Robin, who's going to lead our discussion and debate today.
Today, we're going to really delve more into the environmental impacts and other impacts in the production life cycle of producing an electric vehicle. So from the mining of the raw materials all the way through to the actual production of the car. And there will no doubt be some tangential topics that we cover as well. But that's the bit that we wanted to get to, but we ran out of time on episode 1. And so that's really where we're going to pick up today for episode 2.
Okay, so my key takeaway from the last episode, I think, was I went into that sort of not knowing as much, obviously, as you and Richard know, Robin. But I think I came out of that still thinking, well, okay, great, we all want to save the planet. I'm kind of all in favour of that. But it seems to me that there's a few things going on here. One of which is there's a push by the government and various vested interests, some of whom might be kind of car manufacturers, battery manufacturers, whoever, to push the shift to electric vehicles. It also kind of ties in with if one wants to get conspiratorial about it, electric vehicles are very expensive. Poorer people aren't going to be able to afford them. So this is a part of a push to getting people to use less transport generally. But the key takeaway I think I took from all of it was that actually this is just very, very, very expensive, and that you can get into some of the subtopics like are there enough rare earth metals, whatever, to be able to even build all the batteries we need. But it seems to me like it all seems pretty unachievable, particularly in the time frame that people are given, whether it's 2030 for this or 2050 for that. It just seems to be pie in the sky. I mean, the overarching thing is, do we want to save the planet? Yes, we do. Is this going to help? I'm not quite sure if we're setting unrealistic expectations, or am I being too cynical about this?
I think the theme of my views in episode 1 is that electric cars is a contributor to helping save the planet in time, but for some reason, governments are pushing the electric vehicle narrative over some other things that could be being done, because it's a relatively easy push, because it relies on pushing the people with laws and regulations at the manufacturer level, whereas some of the other initiatives that would have a bigger impact on saving the planet are much harder to actually achieve, because they require much more sort of global coordination, like at the COP summits and things like that, which everyone says, yes, we agree, we're going to do all this, and they get home and forget all about it, kind of thing. I know it's not quite that to that extent, but very small number of initiatives that are agreed upon at COP actually gather any traction, in my opinion, at least. And so I think that's, we're being pushed there. I think in time we will get to a place where electric vehicles are very good, or another power source, whether that be hydrogen or whatever. But I think electric vehicles definitely have their place in the future. We could end up with a mixed fuel setup like we did with, for a period of time we had 4-star unleaded and diesel, and then you've got liquid petroleum gas and stuff like that. So there's always been a variety of fuels, and I think there always will be a variety of fuels. I think electric vehicles will just be one of those. I think one of the things we're going to come on to in this episode is how the electricity that goes into charging cars is derived in the first place, and a lot of that is still fossil fuel. But if you carry on the road that we're on electric vehicles, we will get to a place where electric vehicles are actually very beneficial to the planet. But we need to go through this sort of painful genesis, if you like, the genesis of electric vehicles at the moment.
Robin, I'm going to interrupt. One very beneficial to the planet was what you said, i.e. electric vehicles. But I think, let's be specific here, very beneficial to not increasing the amount of CO2 and particulates that come from the exhausts,
Correct.
which is beneficial to the planet.
Correct.
It
yes.
it is not beneficial to the planet in many other ways, which we're going to delve into.
That's right. But I think where we are today isn't the same place with electric vehicles as where we would be in sort of 10 to 15 years. And so one of those issues is the lithium and the cobalt mining, which we're going to look at in a bit more detail in this episode, is horrific in so many ways. Yet it's absolutely necessary, and it's not just necessary for electric vehicles. It's necessary for almost any electronic device that you use. And so, are we just going to ban all electronics? You can't have hydrogen-powered phones, for example. That would just be absurd. But the fortunate thing about these precious materials that go into these batteries is they are recyclable. The problem is that only one man on the planet at the moment is recycling them at scale, and that's the guy that's the ex-Tesla
CTO.
And then you've got Apple with their Daisy robots that dismantle iPhones and things like that. But the primary objective there isn't to recycle lithium; it's to recycle all the components. So I think where we're going is to a good place. To get there, we've got to travel through quite a lot of dirty places, but is it actually going to have the essence of my argument in the previous episode was, is this actually going to have the impact on the planet that we're being told it is by the media and by governments? And my argument is no, it's a very small contributor, both in terms of the impact that it will have on saving the planet in isolation. It needs lots of other things to move in the same direction that we're being pushed into with electric vehicles or alternative.
Robin, just a point there. I mean, you're right, and you touched on it. This is a long journey, right, in terms of moving to electrification of the vehicles. The question, I think, is you're saying is, will this have an impact on the environment? I think eventually, of course, it's going to have a big impact on the environment, but in this short to medium term, it probably less impact. I mean, at the end of the day, certain places in the world are going to be underwater in 30 to 40 years, whereas in reality, it's going to take a very long time to get the full electrification, not just of cars, but of lorries and planes, etc., to an electrical future. I think even with hydrogen, a lot of the fuel cells are generating obviously electricity. So the powertrain of all these vehicles is going to be electric going forward. That's not a bad thing. It's just a case of how you then power that electrical train, whether it be through batteries or whether it be through hydrogen fuel cells, etc. And right. You're right. The mining, it can have a very big impact on the planet. The scarring of the land and pollutants that come from the side effect of mining, eventually going into rivers and stuff. But as you mentioned, with the recycling, in 30 years time, 40 years time, maybe 50 years time, some people have said that all the lithium and rare metals necessary for electrification of the vehicles out there will have been mined virtually, and we're just going to go into recycling. All the batteries from that point will just be constantly recycled. At the moment, there's basically doing limited recycling of the lithium-ion batteries, but I think my understanding is that Tesla is keeping all of the batteries so that they can recycle them. So in 30, 40, 50 years, you're going to see a completely different world to where we are now in terms of how much is being mined. I know Elon Musk is encouraging people to mine and refine lithium in a really big way, but ultimately eventually those mining companies will have to move on to mining other things, because it's going to be recycling. In fact, the mining companies should be getting into the recycling world, not just the mining side of the business, if they want to have a very rosy future in that space. Basically,
that's a topic for a different day. I think there's still several decades worth of mining left to be done. Are we actually going to revolutionize domestic transport enough and quickly enough to impact the climate change and global warming that's going on at the moment? In my opinion, no, because even if we got to 100% electric vehicles tomorrow, it's not going to stop the planet from warming up. because of all the other things around. Like, for example, at least half of all the energy that goes into charging an electric vehicle, as we discussed before, previous episode, on average, is derived from fossil fuel. So that would need to change for a start. But then you've got all the other industries which are far more polluting. Just doing that one thing on its own isn't going to solve the problem. Doesn't mean it's not a good thing to be doing. And as you said, Richard, we need to travel through where we are now and sort of wind forward sort of 20, 30, 40, 50 years and see where project what the industries surrounding electric vehicles will be at that point, to understand truly what the sort of the end goal of electric vehicle or alternative fuel vehicle production would be like. But we can't do that in isolation. We have to be doing it with everything else.
Robin, I think you had in your accompanying slides, there's a slide that talks about renewable, where the energy sources come by country. And I think it basically has an extreme, South Africa at one extreme and Norway at one extreme. So just to sort of counter your point there about the fact that, over 50% of the energy at the moment is coming from fossil fuels. I think in that slide, South Africa is a big offender where it's like 70 or 80% or whatever it is fossil fuels. But then Norway is nearly a 90-something% renewable. So it does vary by country. So
the point I'm trying to make is that when you're charging your electric vehicle, don't be fooled into thinking that you're charging it with pure wind power or pure wave power or anything like that. It is a mix of fossil and renewable energy. And at the moment, the mix in many places is still, the needle is still pointing towards fossil fuel over renewable. But the layer point on top of that is everything that we do on this planet needs to have a green direction. Otherwise, one thing in isolation isn't going to fix it. Everything around it needs to be fixed. The entire energy ecosystem across the planet needs to have a green direction.
I agree. I mean, unfortunately, most of these governments are not setting a clear picture for the population of their country and saying, going forward, we need to be electrifying everything. And, that's not clear at the moment. They're just talking about CO2 reduction and they're not making it really clear how that's going to happen.
I think, Rich, it's more subtle than that. I think countries will, just like our own, will be able to point to a strategy document. And I think, because I don't have access to it right now, that it will say, this is what we're doing here, transport, power, blah, blah, blah. But we've touched on the point before that the emphasis always seems to be put to us as residential homeowners or the end consumer to change our behavior. And the leaders of the countries are not leading by example. And let me give a clear example of that. Everything in the UK is regarding getting off natural gas for heating our homes, because we've been targeted as we contribute, I think, 40% of some measure, and it's bad. Now, what they've done, because it helps their point, whether it's government or think tanks or academics, is they grouped something together. Every homeowner is a homeowner. Therefore, why don't we just group them together under a label and then blame them for something? Whereas the government's done very little in terms of sorting out their own house, government buildings, local government buildings, armed forces, schools, hospitals. Why aren't they all off the natural gas grid already? Why aren't they all insulated? Why aren't they, Why haven't they shown us that they can be done? Because they have done it. Therefore, pressure test all the equipment and all the technology, such as heat pumps, that they are telling us as residential homeowners we must install. They're pointing at us to do it first, rather than leading by example. So that's kind of a bit of a long, verbose statement I made. But my point is really that I've not seen UK government, and I think across Europe and definitely the States, is the governments and what they control centrally and locally, they're just not leading by example. They're just blaming us as individuals, as homeowners, as parents.
Yeah, and a good example was that the police force have, tens of thousands of cars, right? But it's virtually, I don't think I've ever seen a police car in our country that is an electric vehicle.
I think there probably is one or two, but that then will be moral licensing, right? Look, we've done it. We've got one, so therefore we ticked a box. We're okay. Now we'll go back to what we really want. But you lot, all of you, need to change. And it's not that I disagree with it. I would like to have seen some leadership which is you need to be leading by example. And hey, why don't we group all things that central government and local governments control together and say, well, actually, you contribute the majority of all of these things that we're trying to reduce, therefore tackle it through central funding.
It's the government. Well, that's a bunch of people in very complex bureaucracies with a huge number of priorities. I mean, they're just not capable of leading by example. Government isn't set up to do that. And I think this is a story from a few years ago. I think I'd have to go and dig out the reference, but I think there's a challenge with some of the electric vehicles the UK police were trying to buy. The actual electric vehicles they were using were too slow to catch the fast cars that criminals are using. So actually, what are they doing those electric vehicles for? Well, they're using them for kind of non-emergencies. So you've got an example there of, okay, maybe the technology's probably got better. So that story was probably, I don't know, it's probably 3 or 4 years ago. It was pre-COVID, but actually is the technology there yet? Then you overlay that with all the other competing criteria governments have got, and it's almost easier for anybody in the figure of authority to point the fingers at the citizens and go, you guys aren't doing it properly yet.
100%. It is easier.
Oh, that's right. I know you agree with me, but it's isn't it just a subset of that?
So with insanity mode in a Tesla, right, the police wouldn't have trouble catching. The problem is if the criminal is in a fossil fuel vehicle, all they need to do is just outlast the Tesla, because acceleration in insanity mode isn't going to get you very far. It might get you there fast, but it's not going to get you very far.
I think in practice, Robin, they would have put blockades up, right, against
But the point is valid in the sense that, look, so I agree with Simon that, look, government, typically it's easier for them to point the fingers at the voters and get them to buy into them being to blame for everything. I mean, that's the reality, and that's not new here. But the government, through what they purchase centrally and locally, has power over every ambulance, every police car, every vehicle, every form of way they transport. And why aren't they just leading by example, replacing their whole fleets? It's just that leading by example that's completely missing. So the emphasis, therefore, the responsibility does come down to us as individuals to do this.
Encouraging people to buy new cars obviously drives spend in the economy. It generates VAT revenue for them as well, right? And these cars are not cheap, so they're taking a thunking great big chunk of VAT. When I bought my Tesla, it was £19,000 worth of VAT that the government got in one foul swoop, basically. Yeah, they're encouraging spending. You're right, and they're not keeping their own house in order. But unfortunately, in the UK, the police authorities are divided up, aren't they, into regional authorities, and they are their own little kingdoms, where they make their own decisions on what equipment they buy, from boots up to cars. So yeah, I mean, the message is clearly not getting down to these people. And I think, Robin's joke about the range of these cars, practice in the real world, it's not going to happen. These cars are wickedly quick, right?
I disagree, Richard, totally. The range issue with electric vehicles, Teslas or otherwise, is a big factor that's preventing the police from going into them. Never mind the cost, although normally there are deals worked out with the manufacturers between the police. But the range is an issue. You've got like a 7 or 8 hour shift of a patrol driving around. Well, good luck doing that in a Tesla or any other electric vehicle and still having enough oomph to actually do anything meaningful.
Robin, I'm not sure about that. So look, I mean, the average local police force, I guarantee one of their cars, probably does less than 100 miles in a day.
But if you're talking about motorway patrols and stuff like that, there's no way that they could do that with the range they have at the moment. Once they've depleted the range, the car's then out of service for at least an hour to be meaningfully charged back up.
Again, I don't buy that. Depending on which car you choose, right? Let's say, for instance, they chose a Model S as the longest range of any of the Teslas, and those would be deployed on motorways. And a lot of the time, these police cars are sat on the side of the motorways waiting for cars to go speeding by. So it is possible you could install chargers beside the road so the police could charge the vehicles beside the road. These cars are not constantly going up and down the motorways.
We've gone off topic a bit, and I'm guilty partly for doing that. But the bigger point was that we as individual consumers, just like with UK power topic that we talked about, we're being put on the hook for meeting these deadlines for 2030 for no new ICE cars being sold.
Okay, so let's bring it back to the intent that we had coming into this episode, which is to actually examine some of the environmental aspects of the production life cycle for an electric vehicle. And what better place to start than actually looking at the industries surrounding the mining of the raw materials that goes into the production of not just electric vehicles, to be fair, all electric lithium batteries. The first thing to look at, just so that everyone can really understand the scale of the mining operation involved, is this picture of Thacker Pass. Thacker Pass produces 1 ton of lithium for every 500 tons of earth that are scraped or moved. So that's 1 ton for every 500 tons. And this is just one mine out of many, many lithium mines, and you've also got cobalt mines and various other precious metals as well. But lithium is the really big one. And so this mine here produces 60,000 tons of lithium a year, but it has to move 20 to 30 million tons of earth. That's a staggering environmental cost. I haven't actually done the numbers to compare it to things like gold mining and things like that, which is one of the other most destructive mining operations on Earth. But it's got to be right up there, I would have thought. But then we move on to the human cost.
So, Robin, just before we move on to the human cost, I think it's also worth pointing out that when you obviously mine that ore, as you say, has to be refined. So you take it down to, from dozens of tons down to the actual final product. But then that product needs to be shipped. Now, certain countries like Indonesia are now saying you can't essentially take our lithium from our country without doing the higher value processes. So if you just took the ore and shipped it in a big ship, there's a massive CO2 impact in doing so, because you're obviously taking an unrefined product and then taking it somewhere else and then refining it. So there's another environmental impact in actually shipping the ore or refining it and then shipping the refined product.
Yeah, so that's a very good point, which I missed. So I didn't really get into the why is this an environmental impact? Just digging stuff out of the earth, how can that possibly be harmful? Well, there's a lot of energy that goes into the mining operation, and all of that energy at the moment is derived from fossil fuels, because all the heavy plant machinery, all the diggers and all the trucks and everything, these are all powered by and large by diesel fuel, very polluting. A huge amount of fossil fuel goes into the mining. Then, as Richard says, also the transportation as well, and the refining of these materials, and then the onward transportation after the refining. So there is literally CO2 being expelled at every step of the supply chain, from mine through to the lithium arriving in a battery manufacturing plant. There's just CO2 being given off all the way. So how many sort of kilowatts of energy for a battery do you need to actually be able to produce to be able to repay that CO2? That's kind of a key point here.
And ultimately really highlights that we need to be buying expensive new things that are built using fossil fuels to hit our green targets.
Yes, this is the big irony, right? Is that to hit our green targets, we must use fossil fuels. In order to get to the good place 30 years down the line, we must travel through this heinous fossil fuel driven process or operation, whatever you want to call it, phase, I suppose, to get from where we are today. To get to the green place, we must travel through a yet dirtier place.
That's a really good point. So it's like some sort of tunnel or chasm, if you want some sort of visualization, where it's perhaps even dirtier in the things that we don't like, such as CO2, until we get to where we want to be.
Yeah.
I'm a little cynical about it, but I mean, it makes logical sense. I just don't know how long that tunnel is. the dirty place is there for a long time, I guess, is what I'm a bit cynical about. Because if I'm looking at those machines that are digging those mines, they'll be the last things to ever switch to being ran on green energy.
They can be based on the electric vehicle capabilities that we have today. They could not be run. They would just run flat so quickly. You saw how deep that hole is. Though the trucks have to start on ground level, go down that track all the way to the bottom of the hole, get one load and bring it all the way back to the top. So every day that hole is getting deeper and deeper and deeper. So these trucks have to travel further and further and further. And so the idea that you could power those trucks with electricity right now, irrespective of what Tesla semi trucks and Ford are doing, there's just no way that you couldn't scale it up to these trucks carry tons and tons and tons. There's just not the battery plant you would need to power a truck to do that is probably the same size as the truck itself. Just not going to happen. Why in forward 30 years? Maybe, but by then we'll have far more advanced batteries than we do today. But the positive of all of this, I suppose, that we probably haven't really dwelled on, is that battery technology is improving with each generation of batteries. But that's not really the focus of the topic. But
sorry, Robin, I'm just going to fact check you and Robert actually on the electrification of these large mining equipment.
Okay, you're going to ruin it now.
No. We all need fact checking. You fact checked me in the last episode. I'm going to fact check you in this one, guys. So basically, Caterpillar, I saw it earlier in the week, or last week, sorry, have demonstrated the first electric large mining truck. And also I think that JCB are doing something as well. So you're right, this isn't going to happen overnight. And this is, something that's going to take years and years, but there is work being done in every area to try and electrify this equipment, basically. So it's not perfect. It's definitely behind the cars and behind the electrification of semi trucks, but there is work being done to try and electrify these big diggers as well. And also the electricity can basically, electrical motors are exceptionally powerful, and so electricity definitely can power these. It's the battery. Is it battery or is it hydrogen is yet to be concluded, I guess, is where I'm at on that.
Is it possible that all these very smart people, the electric battery companies, the car companies, the mining companies, the governments, the scientists, is it possible that they're actually mistaken in that, not necessarily on whether this is a thing we should do or not, as I say again, points earlier, all in favour of saving the planet, but is this even achievable? Is it achievable at not just the cost in terms of time and money, but also the amount of disruption and damage it's causing? Going back to the points about we're crossing the chasm, or going through a valley or tunnel, whatever metaphor you choose. This feels really, 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 really difficult and expensive for, frankly, ultimately not that much of an impact on the planet. It feels like there's probably other things we could be doing that are probably going to be cheaper and more effective. And this just seems to be, I don't know, I was already used the phrase, collective insanity. Maybe it is the right thing to do, but it feels that there's a very high risk of it going expensively wrong, or worse, actually just costing an absolute fortune and us not getting to wherever we need to get to. Is that?
Which bit you do mean specifically, Simon? Are you talking about the electrification of mining vehicles, or just
I just think the electrification of everything, right? So if we're saying we need to go and dig things out of the ground, but we can't, we've got to use diesel vehicles to go and do that. Well, Richard's counter argument is, well, the batteries are getting there, but we're decades away from this, right?
Yeah, this is a long-term thing, Simon. I totally agree that there's, as Robin said, in the short term, the next 10, 20 years, there's an ugly phase where fossil fuels are still needed, in mining and refining and even powering of the vehicles. But eventually, 30 plus years down the line, it's not going to be like that. It's going to be the thing about fossil fuels versus electrification via batteries is that fossil fuels we've been digging and pumping out the ground for 100+ years, and we're going to continue to do that. So if we remained on diesel and petrol vehicles or versions of those for the next 100 years, we're going to continue to pump those items out of the ground, and that's going to cause pollution. The CO2 is going to continue to be pumped into the air. Whereas with electrical battery-based vehicles, ultimately you reach a point where you just don't need to mine much more, and you recycle the battery. So ultimately, in 30, 40, 50 years, it's going to be a material difference. So yes, there's going to be, in the short term, not much improvement. In the long term, not in our generation, but in our children and our grandchildren, there will be a positive, very positive impact in the long term, because you just don't need to keep pumping it out. And what we've touched on, the mining and the scarring of the landscape that lithium and cobalt, etc., and nickel mining does to the planet. But we should not forget the impact, again, which is out of sight, out of mind, of the oil industry. The oil industry and petroleum industry, it is, we've had very, very severe catastrophes over the decades. And I've just posted an article which basically lists the 10 worst oil spills that we've seen in history. We've all heard of the Exxon Valdez, the one with BP in the Caribbean area. There's some pretty horrific oil spills that have had massive, massive impacts on the environment. We don't see it because it's happened at sea or somewhere else, but there have been absolutely huge oil spills, millions of barrels of oil just flooding into the sea. The Q80 oil spill here, and the Exxon Valdez, and all these others, right?
It's a really good point, that it's not just the hidden cost of mining these precious metals, because it's the hidden cost of oil and gas exploration has been normalized, right? It has been normalized. You're right that we don't remember, because our memory is so poor, the big spills, unless we've been directly impacted, but they're out there and they're going to continue to happen as well. I just want to roll back a little bit on this recycling. I love the idea that in 30, 40, 50 years time, we'll be recycling every battery and therefore won't have to mine it anymore. The fact that there is no example of that happening anywhere in the world, I believe, for any product that we've used for decades already, glass, plastic, metal, aluminium, whatever, I just don't see, we've got no history. We've got no history of ever being able to do that. So I would be very skeptical. And we can't even recycle our own home rubbish because we ship it to a third world country and then it doesn't get recycled. But we feel happy because we put it into a green bin, a blue bin, a black bin, and it gets taken away. So I like that idea. I think it's really aspirational. I suspect I suspect what will happen is, the next generation or the 5th generation of batteries will just be another precious metal. So we'll be mining that because these ones aren't as good anymore, and we'll need the next shiny new thing because we'll be told we need the next shiny new thing, because that's how our economy works.
So that's a very good point, actually. So to slightly counter that, there is the car manufacturers, or the battery manufacturers, I should say, really, Tesla happens to be both, have a big interest in actually recycling the batteries because it's going to be cheaper for them. Ultimately, they are recycling a very refined product already, rather than taking the 100 tons to get 1 ton out of it, or whatever it is. In this scenario, they're going to recycle and get the stuff. It will be cheaper. And less, should in theory be less CO2 impact as well, because it's not having to be transported around the world. That's one argument. But you're right, Rob, there's a very, very valid argument in what you said about there could be a new shiny new battery technology that comes out in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Does that shiny new battery technology that the industry moves towards, does it use the same rare earth metals? Like, does it use nickel? Does it use cobalt? Does it use lithium? Or is it using some other technology? There is solid state battery technology emerging. And in fact, there's a company floated on the stock market whose name escapes me, who are trying to launch solid state battery technology, that may well and probably does use different elements in order to make it. So yes, there could be a situation like that, but that is, even if that is the case, there will still be all of those batteries that can be recycled, and that those elements could be used in other things within reason, particularly nickel, which is used, I believe, in various other products as well.
Yeah.
So, but there's a very good point. There could be a new battery technology.
I mean, look, it's not could, there will be, and it will rely upon other rare elements that may or may not require us to dig and mine using maybe big lithium-ion battery-powered vehicles to do so. But the way Western economies work, our global economy works, is we're always being sold the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, even if our quality of life doesn't go up. So I can guarantee that will happen here. But I also think Musk is being truthful here. He believes this with regards to the specific category of lithium-ion batteries, but he also will know that won't be where the technology stops. But it's not also just EVs, is it? It's like, look at all these solar panels on top of roofs. They've got a 20-year lifespan, and they're not being, barely. I mean, they've been around for more than 20 years already. They're just not getting recycled. They just get chucked.
You've got the same with windmill blades as well. Windmill blades have a finite life, and as of today, they're largely not made from recyclable materials, or if they are, to recycle them is devilishly expensive from a resource perspective. These are the points that the anti-green movement leap on, which I sort of understand a little bit, but also reject, because in the interest of progress, we must evolve. Progress is an evolution, right? It's not a revolution. And so, you have to make the steps in the right direction. So, I've probably come across previously as anti-electric vehicles. I'm not anti-electric vehicles at all. My point is wake up and understand the situation that we're currently in regarding electric vehicles right now. Don't just think that when you walk into your Tesla shop or your other car dealer and buy an electric vehicle, don't assume that that's immediately a net zero position that you're now in by buying that car. That's the whole premise of my argument about electric vehicles, is that people naively think they go and buy their Tesla, or they go and buy their Blue Motion, Volkswagen, or whatever it is these days, and they're just immediately saving the planet, because it's just not true.
I've just pasted an article in, which I just quickly Googled, which sort of counters your point a little bit, Rob, about the solar panels. It does appear that some of the solar panels are recyclable, and actually somebody has written a very detailed blog here on the recycling process, including some quite funky diagrams about how it works. I haven't looked at it in detail, obviously, because we're going through the process of the recording as we speak, but it may be worthwhile us dwelling on that a little bit, and it shows the solar power panel waste by countries.
This does show you that it's possible, and it's understood how one might do it.
Question is whether it happens.
There is no incentive to make them do it. So I think it's great that it's being talked about, but to Robin's point, I don't think any of us are anti-electric cars. We're just making sure that we understand the pros and cons, and that it's not binary: buy one, don't buy one. We're all going to have some form of electric car at some point. But it is, let's just be real here, that it's being produced through this tunnel, valley, chasm, whatever it is, which is incredibly dirty until you get to a future point. And that future point won't be as rosy as perhaps we believe, because for example, the recycling won't be as robust as as being suggested right now.
So if we look at cobalt mining, particularly, according to this Guardian article, in the case of cobalt, 60% of the world's supply comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where large numbers of unregulated mines use children as young as 7 as miners. There they breathe in cobalt-laden dust that can cause fatal lung ailments while working tunnels that are liable to collapse. And this is the story across all of these sort of precious materials minings. They're all mined in poverty-stricken parts of the world using child labor in very unsafe conditions. And we have to be thankful for that, for everything from our smartphone to our car,
because it's an inconvenient truth that seems to exist. So it's very, very unfortunate and very, very sad. But it doesn't seem like the industry has a solution, or it doesn't seem like governments have a solution for this.
Just to double down on this point, all precious materials and metals particularly are affected by this. So the article goes on to say that for building hydroelectric dams, for copper to provide cables to link wind and solar farms to cities and to build electric cars could also cause widespread environmental damage unless care is taken. It goes on to say that the world's appetite for copper is likely to jump by more than 300% by 2050, according to one recent report. You need 10 kilograms more copper for an electric car compared with one with a petrol engine. That means if you want to turn all the UK's 31 million cars into electric vehicles, you would require about 12% of the world's entire copper output just for Britain. This is an unrealistic demand.
That's interesting, that, because Elon Musk actually tweeted something at the weekend, I think it was, that sort of somebody was suggesting that we would need to double or triple the mining of copper. And actually Musk sort of said, no, that's actually not the case. It's more nickel and lithium, I think.
The fact is, the mining of the materials that go into green technologies is horrendously dirty, both in terms of the environmental impact and the human cost and the child labor and what is basically slavery in the modern age.
Yeah, I agree. The cobalt mining is terrible.
I totally agree. Sorry to dive in there, Richard. I completely agree, Robin. But is the point here again is that all those things are happening a long, long way away. And it doesn't affect the people in their nice homes, etc., etc. What they're actually getting is they're getting, less pollution in the city, which is probably a good thing. But what they're actually doing is just, exporting that pollution to another country, out of sight, out of mind. Who cares, right?
That's right.
And that's a big chunk of it, right?
And I think bringing it back to Rob's point of his skepticism about, in 20, 30, 40 years, as that article quoting Elon Musk said, that we will, we'll have finished mining and we'll just be recycling. Is that really true? Or will we discover that, the next generation of battery technology or some other green technology is dependent on some other precious material that is so far untapped from a mining perspective, and we just continue to mine these green materials using dirty power?
So, Robin, basically, this is, I hope, done a pretty good job of demonstrating this is not click up, this is not binary, this is not black or white. This simple topic of should we buy an EV car now or never or some point in the future has very different levels of, many types of grey in between the two bookends of yes or no. And that's the point, isn't it? That it's a complex question and therefore no easy answer. When you start taking into account things like the cost of manufacturing, the fact that we don't use electric vehicles to mine, to produce, child labor, pollution in other forms, etc. So with all of that in mind, I think let's go round and actually ask each of us, with what we've learned in today's episode and prior episodes, what perhaps we would do differently. Maybe it's one short-term thing, one long-term thing, or maybe it's just one thing that we do differently or perhaps double down on. And let's start with you, Robin.
Okay, so I think we're in a situation with electric vehicles where everything from sort of the mining through to production, the power that goes into that, the energy that goes into that is derived from largely today fossil fuels. I don't think there's an awful lot we can do about that right now on an individual basis. We need the governments of the world to work together better than they are through the COP initiative at the moment to drive some of these revolutions and innovations forward meaningfully. So I don't think there's anything we can really do differently on an individual basis. I think that the difference has to come from a global government basis.
Okay. Simon, what about you? What do you think there?
I don't buy any of this energy transition is needed or even likely to be achievable. I mean, as I say, my long-term worry here is global population. That reduction is going to have much more of an impact than us shifting to EVs. I also don't trust the motivations, whether it's governments or car companies or green and inverted commas politicians pushing energy transmission. You just need to look at Germany, right? I mean, Germany's the Greens in coalition, they've switched the coal-fired power stations back on, and I think something like 35% of energy. One of the courses last year, 35% of German energy came from coal because they don't have the capacity. It doesn't work. So I think there's I think the third thing then is that I worry about the energy transition. It's going to be so expensive, so complicated, so time consuming, so difficult. I don't think we're going to get there. So for me, it's almost a combination of, I think the targets are probably not appropriate. The people pushing it not doing it for the right reasons. And I also think it's probably too difficult to get there. So I think with all of this, am I in favour of finding, unlimited cheap power for people? Well, of course. So let's absolutely, as Robin said, explore those alternative power sources. And again, I think there's good reasons to try and try and cut pollution in cities. But again, who are we relying on to do this? Well, it's the government. What did the UK government say not very many decades ago? Oh, everybody needs to go and get diesel cars. Well, how did that work out? So I don't know. I'd be much more inclined to the kind of at the edges. We should absolutely be encouraging innovation in green energy. But again, to Robin's point, I'd be weighing that up with the broader environmental impacts. I'm not persuaded in the case of electric vehicles that the balance is in favour of the electric vehicles.
Okay, so I'll go next. There's a couple of things that jump out to me that we could do individually and perhaps centrally. And the central one is coming back to this recycling point. I am very skeptical based on our history of recycling more broadly. Therefore, let's learn from the past, and every lithium-ion battery device, every lithium-ion battery produced, every solar PV panel produced, etc. £1, $1, €1 fee that goes into a central fund per country that is explicitly and guaranteed and protected to recycle. That would be something different and not actually expensive in the scheme of the products we are buying, and that would then be forced on a way of forcing, just like we force savings for pensions. This would force us to have a fund to recycle. Secondly, I kind of say this a bit in tongue in cheek, but let's buy less things that we don't need. The new shiny device, the next shiny device, whether it's a handheld device or the car that we replace before we actually need to replace it. I know that would hurt Western economies because the Western economies are built on forcing us or encouraging us as consumers to buy things we don't really need. But if we bought less stuff, we would need less raw material to produce things, and we would pollute less. Richard, what about over to you as to what do you think we should be doing differently, maybe as individuals, but also more broadly?
I like your points about the forced recycling and almost like a tax on the production of products in order to force the recycling of those products later on. So I think we should continue to push the move to electrification of vehicles, whether it be cars, lorries, planes, boats. But I'm a realist in that I realize that there are millions and millions of cars, particularly trucks and boats out there that will not be electrified anytime soon. So there are other technologies out there that could be used in order to reduce the CO2 output of these. Because actually replacing, if you take a perfectly good lorry, for instance, and you go, okay, well that uses diesel, that now needs to be scrapped. That in itself is has a big impact on CO2. So if that lorry has another 10-year life in it, there are alternatives. So there are companies out there now who are able to reduce the CO2 emissions and nitrous oxide or nitrogen or whatever it is out of lorries they claim by 20 to 30% by using LPG gas, so mixing LPG with diesel to reduce the emissions. There are companies out there who are working to essentially use the same sort of technology that was used in Formula One cars, the regenerative braking. So when the lorries are braking, they are actually generating electricity, and that electricity is then used to help power the lorries. So in this example, again, they claim around 20 to 30%. But if you were able to combine both of those technologies, the LPG and the regenerative braking power option, then if you could reduce the CO2 and other chemicals by approximately 40%, that would be a massive saving. And that's something that could be done relatively short term in parallel, because we have to accept that we cannot produce enough batteries at the moment. They're not mining enough nickel at the moment either, and also lithium is challenging in terms of the volume that's been mined on that. So Tesla is producing 1 million cars last year, I think, and it's on track to produce something like that this year. But the reality is that is not enough, and other things need to be done in parallel, and that we should be thinking about the environmental impact on all of these things. So we shouldn't be scrapping things that don't need to be scrapped. We should be looking about, is there an option to make them more efficient, particularly in the third world, where, let's be frank, the charging infrastructure is 1 million miles behind where it is in the Western world, right? We complain about the charging infrastructure for EVs in the UK and America and Europe, but think about South America, Africa, India, and other countries. It is just not remotely in good shape. So we could be using these other technologies, the LPG, the regenerative braking, to essentially reduce the CO2 impact in those areas. But as Rob said, the only way really is to reduce your consumption.
All right. Okay, that's a wrap from us. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode and gained a new appreciation on this complex subject. Things are rarely as binary as they may first seem. So thank you to my fellow co-hosts, Rich, Simon, and Robin. And we look forward to welcoming you all to our next episode. And please remember to like and subscribe to the Paragone podcast. As always, this is about emphasizing discovery, not defense. Bye.